Hello.
He spends more time on vacation than he does in Sugar Land.
Mayor, I mean, why are you here? You never come to these meetings.
I know, I already heard about that.
Carol, turn your mic on. Mic on. William, mic on.
Okay, good afternoon. We're going to call the meeting to order. For Tuesday, March 1st, 2022, the Sugar Land Development Corporation meeting. Thomas, do we have anyone for public comment?
No, ma'am, no one signed up.
Okay, item number 4, minutes. Consideration of an action on the minutes for the November 2nd, 2021 meeting.
Motion approved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, raise your hand.
Aye.
Motion passes. Okay, item number 5, workshop. Review of and discussion on phase 2 of the Activity Center's implementation project. Ruth Lomar, City Planner, Long Range Planning, and Devin Rodriguez, Assistant Director of Economic Development.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I introduce Ruth, I just wanted to take a moment that this Activity Center implementation project, or what you have also heard of as RACNAX, we're now going to be calling it Activity Center implementation, but there's been lots of questions and dialogue, and this is a dialogue that we're going to be continuing as we move forward through the phase 2. So we thought this was a good opportunity to continue to talk about the land use plan, continue to talk about the purpose of this project. And so this is probably going to be the first of many presentations, conversations, and dialogue and questions. And we welcome all of that from all of you as we continue to move through this project. So with that, I'm going to introduce Ruth Lomar, who's our planner of long range planning. And I will hop in when it's my turn, but I leave you with Ruth.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we are here this evening to talk to the SLDC specifically because this project is going to be funded through the corporation. And so we will be coming back at the next meeting at the beginning of February, it's already March, welcome to March, at the beginning of April for a funding resolution from this group. So I'm gonna just first cover a little bit about the project background, kind of remind you of where we've been so far, and then tell you about our next steps with the phase 2 of the project.
Hey, Thomas. I can't hear anyone in the cane room. All of a sudden it just went dark.
Can you please unmute cane room?
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Thank you.
Sorry about that. A little technical difficulty. Okay, let me go back to where I was. There we go. Okay, so these mixed use or these regional and neighborhood activity centers are envisioned to be mixed use walkable areas with uses like retail, office, residential, public spaces, institutional uses, things like that. And the land use plan also included an action item that directed us to evaluate the best way to implement these activity centers. So our current zoning does not have any kind of mixed use zoning. The development code doesn't have any standard mixed use zoning districts. So the only way that we can implement any kind of mixed use walkable center is through the plan development district. The plan also encourages the city to be more proactive in redevelopment. So it recognizes that we have come to a new phase of development as a community where we're almost built out. And the only way that we can grow as a city now is to intensify the areas that are already built out and so to redevelop what already exists today. City Council has already provided also some previous direction to kind of be on the take a more extensive approach to redevelopment, which you may remember Jim also talked about an all-in initiative that the city is working on to look at what that really means for commercial redevelopment and to take a more extensive approach to it. And the City Council also identified commercial redevelopment as one of its top 4 priorities at a recent retreat. So I'm going to let Devin step in here and talk a little bit about the economic development impact cycle.
So we thought it was important to just stop here for a moment and talk about this economic development impact cycle. We've had this image around, it looked a little bit different. We're trying to kind of improve upon it to be able to educate, like, what does this mean of what our primary focus is in economic development. So the primary mission of the Economic Development Department is to create those primary jobs. Primary jobs are jobs that provide goods and services that are mainly consumed or utilized outside of the community. So not service-based or small businesses that are focused more on servicing the community that they're in, but primary jobs being far reaching out into the national global economy. So our primary function is to attract those jobs. We also have our destination venues on there, which is Constellation Field, Smart Financial Center, Houston Museum of Natural Science, because those venues attract visitors here to spend their dollars. So between the primary jobs and the destination venues, that then creates the demand for housing and hotel rooms, right? People coming to destination venues wanting to stay in our hotels. But those jobs bring people that want to live in Sugar Land because they're also working in Sugar Land. It creates that demand for the housing. So then when the housing happens, new residents, you have a new population, you have the buying power. That buying power is then what creates the demand for new retail and dining establishments. And then the revenue from that retail and dining establishments then gets funneled into the city for quality of life amenities and obviously our public services. But as we continue to talk about redevelopment and creating mixed use centers, this cycle is really an important concept. We need to create a framework and the drivers for then creating those additional uses that we want. If there is certain types of retail or dining establishments that we want, we need to create the demand for it through the jobs that then create the housing that then create the buying power for those retail establishments. As an example, we don't need to look any farther than our founding. So we started as a company town. Imperial Sugar came, created jobs. Those jobs created the demand for housing. Housing created the demand for those retail and dining establishments. And that is how Sugar Land came to be. So I just want everybody to keep this in mind as we continue to talk about redevelopment and mixed uses and how all those things interrelate together, especially also when we talk about market realities and financial feasibilities of projects moving forward. I would, sorry about that.
Okay, so we began the project to evaluate the best way to implement regional and neighborhood activity centers by bringing on Clarion Associates to help us with the project back in 2021. And we split it into 2 phases. The first phase was, what's the best way to incentivize redevelopment? Really just kind of answering that question. So Clarion helped us to answer that question by doing some stakeholder interviews that included interviews with council members, planning and zoning commission, members of our development community, property owners and regional and neighborhood activity centers, city staff. So a really wide range of different stakeholders, kind of asking the question, what's going well with the development process? Where are the hiccups? What do we need to do to look at for improvements? They also did some benchmarking of peer cities. There's a map there that shows some of the examples of the peer cities they looked at, but really, how is redevelopment, mixed use redevelopment done in other communities, and where is it successful and how is it successful? And we also actually got to talk to some of the staff in those communities so we could see not just the code itself, but also how is it working in practice. And then from there, they made some recommendations for future approaches to implementation. So we reviewed those recommendations that came out of that phase 1 work with a joint workshop with City Council and Planning and Zoning Commission here back in November last year. So you did hear those recommendations, but I recognize it's been a few months. So I want to just kind of briefly recover those for you so you don't feel like you have to try and remember everything that we talked about back then. So I apologize, that's a little small on this screen. So the phase 1 recommendations start with the land use plan. So basically what we have in the land use plan, looking at those specific areas of the neighborhood and the regional activity centers is a great place to start. Then build on our unique assets, thinking about our history, our water features, our landscape, green space, and really kind of building around those. Educating and building community support. So really thinking about how can we bring the community along through this process, and then helping the community understand the land use plan and where it came from for those that didn't get engaged at that point in time. And talking about that economic development cycle and how things are so tied together, and how it all really works together. They've talked about simplifying and incentivizing redevelopment. So some examples of that, including incentives that might encourage redevelopment, like development bonuses or reductions, or kind of simplifying the development review process. Talked about rating in the PD. So we've recognized all along that the PD is going to be around. We're not proposing that we get rid of it, but we do need to look at kind of readjusting what we use it for, and the breadth of it, and maybe streamline it a little bit for future purposes. And then embracing a balanced approach. So recognizing that the best thing we can do is create multiple tools, and then for each project that comes forward, figuring out which tools are the best ones to use for that particular project. But one of the big things that we're really going to be focusing on in phase 2 is the zoning for mixed use, which is really creating a development code that allows the uses and the vision that we want to see in these areas by right, instead of having to go through an arduous process. We want to create an environment that allows what we've envisioned. And so what they recommended is that we establish 2 new mixed-use zoning districts based on the regional activity centers and the neighborhood activity centers. That we create mixed-use oriented development standards. So that's looking at the width of the sidewalk and how far back the building should be from the sidewalk, and where the parking lot should be in relationship to the building. Those are some of the big things that I think of when I think about the difference between a town square type environment and in comparison to a more suburban type environment. They also, though we would have those mixed use standards, we do need to allow for some flexibility to make sure that there's ability to kind of operate around existing conditions, or these are going to be redevelopments, so we're going to be working within, in some cases, constrained environments, so being able to flex to those conditions. And along those lines, also encouraging incremental progress. So we're not going to see hundreds of acres all develop into mixed use centers at one time. This is going to be a small site by site, likely site by site process. And so we want to create a code that helps us with that. So maybe if someone, property owner, wants to do a facelift on their building, along with that, then they also need to improve the pedestrian connection to the sidewalk network, or basically defining those those sort of benchmarks that when you get to this point, then this is the kind of improvement you need to do to build on that mixed use environment. They've also talked about enhancing opportunities for multifamily residential. So they recognize the progress that we've made with the land use plan and how it does provide direction that multifamily is appropriate in regional neighborhood activity centers. But they've encouraged us to continue thinking about that and looking at that, that there may be a need to even expand those opportunities beyond what exists today. Focus on targeted areas. There was an example of a peer community where they went in and rezoned all of the property that had been designated in their plan as mixed use of some sort. And they didn't necessarily see the traction or the movement with the development and redevelopment in those areas that they had hoped. And so what they suggested was maybe start a little bit smaller and really focus on certain areas where you want to see some movement and where maybe you see the traction most immediately, and then kind of grow from there. And then finally, supplement zoning with other incentives. So this would be just a kind of a recognition that we have our kind of typical economic development incentives that we do, whether it's tax abatements or those kinds of things. But there's other incentives we can do, like building permit waivers, or different things like that, because it just kind of help through the process in these specific areas where we're really trying to encourage redevelopment. So that's kind of how we got to where we are. So over the last few months since that, we had the November Planning and Zoning Commission workshop meeting and Planning, Zoning, and City Council meeting, where we presented those recommendations, and we heard some feedback from council and commission. And I think on the whole, there was a recognition that the recommendations were kind of where we needed to go. We kind of massaged them a little bit. We talked about sort of a hybrid approach where there would be an opportunity still for some community input, a PD light, maybe you might call it, for some certain developments. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at through phase 2 of this project. So we've divided phase 2 into 4 tasks. First, we're going to do some initial outreach. Then we're going to create an annotated outline. Then we'll put together the draft amendments, and then go through the adoption process. So we're anticipating it'll take about 12 months to complete. And as I mentioned, this is a contract we anticipate funding out of the SLDC budget at just over $75,000. And this project is moving forward with Clarion, who we used for phase 1. And so I'll just walk through each of those tasks in a little bit more detail. So the initial outreach, we are proposing to create a city manager joint city council planning and zoning commission advisory task force. So this is a new creature that we've never done anything like this before. But we recognize that through the joint workshop, we heard that the commission and council want to be involved in the development of these regulations of these standard zoning districts. And so that's really the primary purpose of this group would serve, is to provide input to staff as we're going through this development code update process. At the beginning, we would establish some kind of principles of success so that we are all kind of going in the same direction, where we want to increase certainty for our development partners through this process, or we want to ensure that the public has input on X, Y, or Z type of projects. And so we'll be working with that group to create those principles of success. And those will kind of be our bumpers along the way as we're going through. We'll also have a more in-depth education process as far as kind of how the development process generally works, and a little bit more about these activity centers and redevelopment. And then our hope is that these members will then also serve as champions for the project with the 2 groups as we're working through the process with Planning, Zoning, and City Council. So the joint advisory task force membership would be a total of 6 members. We would have 3 from Planning and Zoning and 3 from City Council. Our recommendations is that the current members of the EDC serve as the City Council membership for the board, and that they would serve throughout the duration of the project, even if EDC were to change at some point during the project, just for a continuity standpoint. Staff is going to work with the Planning and Zoning Commission chair to identify the members from Planning and Zoning that would serve on the board. So task 1 is really just kind of getting that group going and getting them ready for task 2, which is where the consultant will be developing some regulatory approaches. So they will be coming up with the 2 mixed-use zoning districts and giving us some recommendations for some specific development standards that would be incorporated into that, some procedural tools for flexibility. And then they would also be looking at which code sections they recommend that we amend to incorporate those changes and provide us with a range of options for, kind of, this is sort of best practices in this range. And then we can identify where we want to land within that range based on those recommendations. They're also going to be including illustrations and examples. I know I'm a very visual person, and I think that that's really helpful when you can see, what does this really mean to have a 10-foot sidewalk versus a 5-foot sidewalk or whatever. So I think that's going to be really helpful. So the consultant will do that work to come up with those regulatory approaches for us to look at. Staff will look at it and come up with some recommendations. And then we'll present that to the task force, and the task force will provide some feedback to staff on that. We're estimating maybe about 4 meetings during this part of the process to go through that review. And then after that, we would take the draft regulatory approaches to a joint meeting with the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council. Again, recognizing that there was interest in both of those groups really being involved in the development of these districts. And then finally, we would wrap up this task with public review of that annotated outline, which we would do through some kind of in-person town hall, or we haven't exactly fleshed that out, but some kind of in-person event, and then also an online opportunity. Once we've established sort of that outline, then we would get into actually drafting the code amendment. So this is where the literal section 2.5 of chapter 3 is going to read like this. And it's all going to be based on what we hear from from that first draft, and then we'll incorporate the changes that we hear from Planning and Zoning and City Council at the joint workshop, as well as from the public during the public input opportunities. Again, we'll have the task force review those draft code amendments and provide input to staff on what they think. Again, estimating about 4 meetings of that group, and follow up again with a joint P&Z and council meeting and some more public review. This one would actually just be an online opportunity. I apologize, I should have corrected that. Not an in-person, because we hope to get the substance of the feedback from the public in that first round when it's a little more conceptual, and then not having to read like the nitty-gritty details of the code amendments. And then finally, we go into the adoption phase, which is where we're really just finalizing those code amendments, again, based on the feedback we're hearing along the way. And Clarion will also be developing an executive summary of these changes, kind of talking about the changes and what it really means, and how it gets applied in different places, and how it's different from the current code. We'll place all of that online for the public to look at and provide some general input. And then we'll go through our standard required process, which would be a Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing and recommendation. And then City Council would also have a public hearing and 2 readings of an ordinance. So through all of that, obviously community education and engagement is really important. And so we plan to have a project webpage where we'll have information that will keep the public updated on what's happening and where we are in the process. We are going to have a communications plan that we're going to develop, and it's going to be coordinated with the commercial redevelopment all-in kind of communications campaign. So there's kind of a lot forthcoming that we want to make sure the community is aware of what we're talking about. And then, as I previously mentioned, there'll be those specific input opportunities when we have the deliverables from the consultant, and when those are complete at the annotated outline, the draft code amendments, and at the adoption draft. So as I mentioned earlier, our next step is that we'll be coming back to the SLDC for the funding resolution at the next meeting on April 5th. And then we'll also be bringing the contract to City Council that same evening for approval, and hope to be getting started very shortly thereafter. So if there's anything else I want to add, or
I just wanted to add on the commercial redevelopment all-in. You might remember from the workshop last week in Jim's presentation, he had that slide that said planning's head start. And so we really see this activity center implementation project and getting the land use plan to match up with our zoning code as a first step of being able to encourage that extensive redevelopment that has been pointed out as a goal for the city moving forward in terms of where our future lies for Sugar Land. So just kind of want to make that connection between that council workshop and this being that planning head start of the phase 2 contract. That I think, do we have questions? Okay. So we're happy, we encourage lots of questions. I know that we get some kind of misconceptions of stuff, and so we want to make sure that we answer any questions that y'all might have. You know, one that I think has been really common is the size or the space of a regional activity center. So Town Square here is not the regional activity center. It is a much broader area. So when we're having these incremental projects come forward, we're talking about bringing those elements into the overall 100-acre, 200-acre regional activity center. So we have those mix of uses, we have that walkability. So that's a common one, but please ask questions.
Joe,
Go
ahead, sir.
Ruth and Devin, I think it's really important that we define, for example, incremental versus comprehensive. And we provide some guidelines. I think it's also important that we make sure that we send the message to the community of there's a difference between a short-term investment, flip it, and a long-term investment. And I think the type of investment I'm looking for, I can't speak for the council, is a long-term investment. And so we need to spend some time figuring out how we incorporate that. I'm not saying you can't do incremental, but incremental needs to be part of a more comprehensive analysis, for example, of a regional activity center or a neighborhood activity center.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good and important distinction that we will continue through this process, I think, discussing, because redevelopment is not easy, right? You guys heard Jim say that it's hard. And one of the reasons that it's hard is because, one, you have already established value on the tax rolls, very valuable. It might not be the shopping center that you want, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth millions of dollars. And so how do you make those changes or make it make sense in the market reality for changes to occur? And then another example is, parcels, right? You could have a center that is actually owned by 6 different people. And so how those market realities of how you get those things moving. But I think that incremental question is going to be something that we need to figure out what's right for Sugar Land. And we are going to need to get some comfort in it, with knowing that we have the land use plan as our guide that has already had extensive work and community input in it. So leaning on that as sort of our guide moving forward. Yeah, good point.
Follow up to that, Devin, is that's exactly where it may be that we being the city of Sugar Land, make a direct investment in order to get the kind of development that we want. And we'll need to be able to provide for that. Council gets to make the decision, but we need to have that look wherever that is in that plan. That council, if they say, for example, if it's going to be one type of development and we think it could take another step forward, if we invested in it, then we need to be able to accomplish that.
And we have a long history of that, right? So, yeah, and where is that priority and target? Because we're not going to be able to do that for every project.
Right.
We're going to have to create a framework so that it's encouraged overall citywide, but where are those opportunities?
Are there certain zones that we want to target?
Exactly. What are those targeted areas? I think that's another good discussion point for the task force.
My turn. First of all, I concur with what you're saying, because there is confusion when a rat comes in.
that people think it's going to be developed at one time. And this is a perfect example of the one we're doing now, because I think it's all in one and it's inclusive. So we do need to find an element to address that. But secondly, on that note that goes along with it, what is the difference? Where are we going to use a PD anymore? I mean, when we look at redevelopment, we don't have room for PDs much anymore. So when you say we're going to keep a PD, where in the world are we going to keep it?
Yeah, so I mean, there still could be places where, and it's going to be a side-by-side property owner by property owner, decision. There could be places where they're wanting to do something that's just different, which is really what the
floor track
PD.
would be- Is a grassroots track that may lend itself to a PD.
That's possible.
We wouldn't know. The
Yeah.
industrial site over by the airport may also lend itself to a PD.
I think the key is to think about the PD as being something that should be more of the exception than the rule, and it should be for exceptional projects, something that is really different, unique, bring something to the table that we're not going to get through our standard zoning districts. And that, do what?
And maybe scale,
Yeah.
like how large, of an area or certain circumstances are we talking?
Okay, so having served on planning and zoning, of course, the mayor did as well. I have so many questions and I'm not going to use up all my time at this point to do it. We can have a meeting. But when we take away the PD process, we take so much of public input away that some of the development we have in our city that's so great because of that input, I fear we lose. So I don't want to take that element away. I think it's righteous that we keep it because that's why we're here as elected officials, as council, as P&Z. We put those people in place to protect that right.
Sure.
My greatest fear is if we move forward with too much watering down of that input, we lose what we are here for. Not that I don't trust staff or the council, but we aren't going to be picking, council as a whole, or the people are not going to be picking people on those committees. All due respect, they're probably fine, but they also change over time, and we may not have that same leadership that we are expecting. So I want to be careful in how we put those into place and make sure those mechanisms for oversight and inclusion of the people of the city. Because the way it's looking right now, I think you've done a fabulous job of that first phase one slide of all those different points are fabulous. But how to implement them and bring it forward and make sure we do it the Sugarland way, which I call inclusion, transparency, and doing it perfectly right, have got to be part of the progress. So my second question.
Can I address?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I know it's a lot. Thank you.
No, yeah, there's a couple of things I want to touch on, and then one just point of clarification. You mentioned something about committees, people changing on committees or something. Can you?
Well, okay. So EDC and planning and zoning, we're going to have some people in 3 years drop off, obviously, because we're going to change. We may get re-elections. So that's what I'm talking about.
Oh,
change.
okay. So
I don't mean they're going to be thrown off or anything.
I gotcha. So just to clarify, I think what you're talking about is the joint task force.
Yes, the joint task
Will really, it's just going to serve for the duration of this phase 2 of the project.
Okay.
It's not intended to be a long-term, long-standing, unless the council decides that there's value in that for some other purpose, but that's not necessarily what we had envisioned at this point, is that they will serve to provide feedback on this specific project as we're developing the standards. So just to clarify that. So you mentioned concern about losing opportunities for the public to provide input. And there was another element that some of the development that we have in Sugarland is because we get that public input.
Yes.
So first I want to say that we're not losing the public input because there will be opportunities. All those opportunities I laid out in phase 2, those are the public input opportunities, is to tell us what is good and what's bad about what we're recommending in these districts. Same thing with the Planning and Zoning Commission and Council. This is your opportunity. That's why we've really built in a lot of ways, more involvement of the commission and council than we have traditionally done with development code updates. We don't normally do joint workshops. We don't normally do even a task force of one or the other, much less a joint task force. So this was a very intentional proposal and development of this approach to make sure that there are lots of opportunities for the commission and council to see what we're doing, what we're proposing, and come along the way and say, no, that's not going to work, or, we need to change this or look at that differently. the second half of what you said, that, we do have great development in Sugar Land, but I think I would push back a little bit that a lot of it has to do with public input, because there are a lot of PDs that go forward that we don't hear from anybody on. And so to say that public input opportunity is influencing that development, I think is a little bit exaggerated, or it's overstated a little bit. And the reason I want to point that out is that process is very arduous for a developer to go through. And so we want to make sure that if we're going to have somebody go through that kind of process, we're getting something really great and really valuable out of it. And it's not to say that we haven't gotten great development out of PDs, but we can get great development out of great development code. We don't have to have a PD process to get great development. And I think that's what we're trying to move towards, is to say, hey, developer, we have these really high standards, and it's right here in the development code. You know exactly what it is going into it because you can read it online, and there's no question about what's going to be expected of you. We can have those high standards established, and everybody knows what it is. And you live up to it or you don't, but that's what it is.
And I would just add to that, you had seen on that slide about the balanced approach. Some of this is like what Ruth was just talking about. We need to create some sort of consistency and roadmap and transparency to the development community to continue to attract that development here. And the PD process, the way it is laid out right now, isn't going to provide that for us. And so we need to do both. We need to set our standards up front of what we're expecting, but also have that balanced approach of transparency. And this is our process, and this is what we expect for you to go through. But have it within a reasonable time frame that I think some of you may have heard, that is not longer than what their option period is on a purchase agreement, because we want to continue to encourage that type of investment and reinvestment in Sugar Land. And so we need to find that balanced approach.
And then one more thing I also wanted to follow up. Another opportunity for public input is when we actually do the rezoning. So what we're talking about here is creating new zoning districts. We as a city can create new zoning districts, put them on the books, and they could never show up on a map. Or we can say, we want to find some target areas. We want to say, these are areas we really want to focus on. Let's go ahead and proactively city initiate rezonings for these. They're still going to go through the same rezoning process that we do for any other kind of rezoning. It's just, we're not going to have that negotiation. Is it a 10-foot sidewalk or is it an 11-foot sidewalk? Is it a 4-inch caliper tree or a 5-inch caliper tree? It's all going to be laid out in the development code, and it's just going to be, rezoned to that new district, or it's not. And so through that process, we notify property owners within 200 feet of the rezoning. And so that's another opportunity. And we haven't necessarily laid this out, but I believe it to be true. There will be more than just that standard notification for these, because this is a really important effort that we're doing. And so there's going to be a broad community education that's just going to continue on through these processes.
Okay, so what I heard you just say is when we rezone a property from like office to mixed use, or to this new zoning,
yes,
they will have an understanding of what that zoning process looks like, or what that zoning includes.
Correct.
So they will have some transparency of what they're going to get, although we don't have a layout or exact LOI for all the stuff that's going in there. We're going to know what it looks like.
Right.
So that is that's a something that they can look at and say, I know what's
You're
going
gonna
to
know
be.
what the uses are. I'm not sure you're gonna know what it looks like.
No, you won't know what it's looking like.
What I would clarify is the rezoning piece of it. We don't know this yet, but what we talked about like the process here is just creating the code that Ruth talked about. When we actually go to rezone, it could be that the city initiates that we really want to prioritize this regional activity center first. And so we're going to initiate that. It's not going to be rezoning one parcel. It's going to be rezoning that entire tile.
Right.
But that is another opportunity for the public to be engaged in that. And so I just want to make sure that it's not a parcel by parcel opportunity. It will be either initiated by an applicant, or it could be city initiated, and we just don't know what that is yet, because part of one of the discussion points with this task force is going to be, and with Clarion, is how do we want to go about strategizing applying these zones? Do we want to prioritize one regional activity center first, 2 all of them. We're leaning towards not all of them because of what we've heard, but those are some of the discussion points that we'll have.
Thank you.
Stuart,
Thank you. A question about land use plan. So what type of authority does the land use plan have? It's not an ordinance, right? Is it just simply recommendations or statement of goals?
So it is technically adopted by ordinance, but it is not the code. The land use plan is part of the comprehensive plan, which establishes the broad vision for the city. Where do we want to go? Who do we want to be when we grow up? It's guidance. But what's important is that it's guidance that was directed by the community. There was a lot of community engagement, 5 years worth of work that went into that. We had a land use advisory committee that worked on that document. It went through the Planning and Zoning Commission. It went through the City Council. And so when we make changes, we just want to keep that in mind, that it is just guidance. It's not the code, but it was extensive process that we went through to come to that, to come to that end. So it's guidance, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Carol,
Now, on the proposed mixed-use zoning districts for RACs and NACs, so would it still go through P and Z and City Council and have a public hearing at each of these? Or would P and Z and Council be eliminated from the process and this be administratively approved?
So whenever we're going through this process, we'll create the zoning districts first that's what Clarion's going to help us do. And that is, like I said, that's just changing the text of the development code. That's not actually changing the map. So that will go through the public hearing at planning and zoning, recommendation, City Council public hearing, first and second
But I'm
reading.
talking when an actual specific
Right.
project comes, okay, developer said, here's my project,
Right.
and I want to go through the mixed-use zoning
Okay.
district RAC.
Okay.
Okay, so then do we have a
Yes.
public hearing at P and Z and at council?
So it will.
Because before you're saying it's going to be administratively approved once the zoning district's got in place. That's what I understood back in November.
Okay, so we're talking about different parts of the process. So in the overall development process, you have the zoning, and then you have site plan, and you have plating, and there are other elements that happen when we do a PD. We're sort of bringing the site plan into the zoning process. But in standard zoning districts, someone comes forward and says, I want this to be business office now instead of general business. They're not showing you a layout plan. They're not showing you the specifics of their development, but they're going to follow the regulations associated with that because they're going to that new district. And so staff is administratively ensuring that they're following the regulations of the new district, the business office district in that case. So we're going to check it through the site plan process to ensure that it meets the setbacks, that it meets the height, that it meets the bulk plane from the nearby residential, that it has the right number of trees, and all of those things that are associated with zoning. So in the case of mixed use, it would be the same process. So the difference here is there may be areas where we go in and proactively rezone it as a city and say, this is a target area. We want to go ahead and move forward with that rezoning. And so we'll go through the public process at that point, and then developer comes in and says, I want to build this within this regional activity center zoning area. For example, if what they're proposing complies with these strict standards that we've established through this process, then that's what will be approved administratively by staff. Now, we did talk about having kind of a hybrid approach for certain developments, and that's something that we're going to have to work through, where we don't know what that looks like yet. There's kind of a lot of ideas that we've tossed around as staff as like what that could look like, whether it's maybe there's just a layout plan that gets reviewed by Planning and Zoning Commission, or it goes through Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council, but it's not the whole thing like we look at right now with the PD. It's just the layout plan, or it's just a certain element of what we kind of have become accustomed to seeing through the PD process, but it sort of narrows down that really broad review and kind of helps, again, with the developer's ability to know with some more certainty that, these are the standards that I'm gotta follow. And then it's really just kind of looking at exactly how my building is laid out on the site for this particular type of use.
But your question is more, So in a typical zoning category, we have that right now.
Right.
If the developer builds it according to that category, there is no negotiation and there is
Right.
no input
Right.
from
And-
council or P and Z.
Yeah, and that's what my concern
You're
is if you're.
required to
yeah.
do it. And in here, you know, I think that's what the process is about, is what are we comfortable with? From a developer standpoint, you know, they want to have something with certainty. If everybody has to, if it's going to be a negotiation, you might as well leave it like a PD. Because that's basically a negotiation.
Right.
Can I try to give like an oversimplified example? I think it's a little, because I'm a planner in training and Ruth is an economic developer in training as we tackle this project. But so I want to give an example of, think about it as we have this matrix, right? And you have a project coming forward and it's an existing building and they want to expand by 5,000 square feet. So for our code, it's under 10,000 square feet. We don't consider that a major expansion. And so that is going to be handled administratively by staff based off of what is said in the code, and they meet all those requirements. But we have another project come in that it's actually going to be an infill site. They're going to be building brand new. We're talking about 200,000 square feet. And that is now above our threshold. And so now that process is going to work with staff. It's going to require a public hearing at P&Z, and then it's going to require I'm just making this up, a recommendation to city council, and then consideration by city council. So we can build in different thresholds for this project. If we're considering it a minor expansion project, this is a major infill project in this regional activity center, which is zoned as mixed use. And therefore it's going to require a public hearing and 200 feet radius, noticing. So through this process of developing this code, we're going to, am I totally off? Okay. We're going to be developing those thresholds of what is considered minor that could be handled administratively by staff, and what's going to be considered maybe moderate or major that is going to still require a public hearing and either approval by P&Z or approval by city council. We're talking about different layers. Don't think of the zoning code as you have this code, and as long as you meet all these things, you guys can do whatever you want. We can structure it however we want, from a minor project to a major project. Or, if they want to throw in a whole nother use that's not even allowed per the code, well, then that's going to be either an exception, which we don't do exceptions or variances, right? We don't use that word. And so that would be a whole different ballgame. So you think of these as different layers, that it's not just because we create this code and now it's just going to be handled completely administratively by staff. We're talking about different thresholds of projects, and therefore when is it going to trigger more transparency, more community involvement, but yet still certainty on the applicant side of the process that they're expected to go through.
Yeah, and I feel like as staff, we have a pretty good understanding of the things that, and you as council and planning and zoning have a good idea of the things that you hear from the community about most. There are certain elements of those PDs that we just don't ever hear people concerned about or complain about. And so those are the kinds of things that could be in the code that you could say, okay, everybody, this is just what you're going to follow, because we all agree these are good standards. That's what we need to follow. And then there's those other things, again, like the site layout or the big project, where those are the things where we want to focus our attention and say, okay, public, P&Z and council, this is what we want to focus on, because we've all agreed these are great. We don't need to talk about those. Let's talk about the things that we do need some conversation
Can
about.
I just summarize it by saying giving carte blanche to administration for 25 or 30 acres is, I don't know how we could do that, but understand that you can handle the small things all day long is fine. But it's like the 20 or 30 acres that just will freak everybody out.
I don't think anybody's talking about 20, 30
Right.
Well,
And that's what we need to make clear, is that we're not giving staff carte blanche to develop 20 or 30 acres without our input our oversight, our knowledge. And that's what we need to make clear in this process, because
and that
that's
was-
not gonna
Yeah, well, that's where
fly.
I was coming from. I was thinking, when I had asked my question, I was thinking in terms of a regional activity center.
Right.
And just to be able to have carte blanche, administrative approval on a regional activity center without any public input, I don't think so a good way to go. But-
That's not how the zoning works, though. That's not how zoning works today. We have zoning standards.
Well, I'm talking about through the
other
PD
areas.
process, yeah.
So don't think of the regional activity center or the mixed use zoning, anything different than the other standard zonings that we have. It's us creating the standards for that and those different levels and thresholds because I'm sure there's things in our standard zoning now that still require going to P and Z
Right.
and still require going to city council. We're just talking about creating that structure. And correct, I don't think
For
25, 30
rezoning,
acres.
everything's
Right,
required to go to P and Z. And there is no, I don't think on rezoning, there is an exception.
No.
Right, to actually.
I don't
rezone
care,
a piece of
I don't
property.
care how big the sidewalks are, I really don't. You know about sidewalks, I don't care. It's not that I don't care, but that's not something we need to look at.
Yeah.
That needs to be whittled out.
Well, and so there's some really good case studies out there too. Like, I think we've already through the phase one have talked to other communities that have been in a similar position where they've had regional activity centers that have sat stagnant. And they've tried as many incentives that they possibly could. They bring all the developers they possibly can to the table. And at the end of the day, when they're negotiating a purchase agreement, they need certainty of certain aspects of it. And so like there are communities who have had the same reluctance and same hesitancy and same concern as y'all. And so I think we can kind of bring some more of those case studies back, maybe even testimonials, and have them here to help you understand, like, what did they learn? What would they do differently? And that kind of thing. But like, I think what the major message that y'all need to hear today is y'all are going to have a significant amount of input in this process. We are not doing this alone. We have the PNC, we have city council, and we want the community along for the ride, the whole entire way.
That's what the task force is all about.
That's exactly right.
So like, we hear you, we want to reassure you, you will be a very active and part of this process if you want to be. We want y'all there, we want your support. I think at the end of the day, we all have this vision for what Sugarland is and what we want it to be and all the future that we have for it. And that's what we're trying to do today, is to get us closer to having a little bit of a shorter process, a little bit more certainty, so that we can get the excellent development that we really want and believe in our city.
And I agree, the PD process it does need to be reined in. It has gotten a little too lengthy and cumbersome, and we need more certainty, with the developers, and so that we can attract that. I just don't want to go too far, get completely out of the control oversight process, because I mean, it's one thing to bring in the public and everybody to have input on these sort of generic codes and stuff, but it's a whole different story when you have an actual, project that shows up.
Sure.
So,
Well, and I think that honestly, that's why the illustrations through this process are also going to be really helpful, because it helps kind of bring to light, like, what does that really mean? It's as though you are looking at an application and saying, is that really what I want to see whenever something comes forward? But as Devin said, we are recognizing the value and the need for sort of a tiered approach, where there will be elements that will still continue to come forward to, through the process, and others that are smaller, more contained, or, all of that has to be defined. There's no predefined what those thresholds or values are. That's all going to be worked out through this process.
Okay. And circling back to a comment you made earlier, I guess I've just sort of heard that, taking the Kaplan project, for example, that based on some input at, I don't know, the public hearing, or maybe a HOA meeting or something like that, that they had taken that input to heart, and that they had actually made some changes to their project between when they first submitted it to the city and between then and the P&Z vote, and that these number of changes were I guess were beneficial and stuff. So that may be what Councilor Watley was referring to as, and I said, I agree, sometimes they go through and nobody even pays any attention, but I've heard that there had been some, I guess that this had been taken to heart, and had some changes had been made as a result of some.
Sure.
I tell you, we probably need to cut that conversation off, because that's a conversation for council when it comes to council. I don't want to, that's not going to get discussed in this setting.
But I would say more generally speaking, there are certainly examples where public input has guided a specific element. And I don't want to imply that there has been no value. Please don't take that away from this conversation. There has been value in public input, but there are a lot, I would say there are a lot, probably more in number of cases that go forward where we don't have substantive public input. And so I think it's maybe even looking back at those cases and saying, where have we had public input? Where are the things that have been kind of those hot button issues for the public? And maybe that's where we start to say, okay, maybe those are the ones we do need to continue bringing forward. Those are the elements that that surpass that threshold of administrative approval. But recognizing that there's a lot that we've done that hasn't, garnered a lot of public engagement.
Okay, William, you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to take about 30 minutes here and cover, no.
You got
I'm just
about
kidding.
2. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, or about a minute. I want to circle back for a moment to what the mayor said earlier. I personally see and agree that long-term investment here is always going to be better for Sugar Land. I'm not saying short-term doesn't. I love that you said that. With that said, I also want the most efficient government that we can get. And if this is producing that, I want that with accountability. That's it. At the end of the day, we want the most efficient government out of all of us, out of our executive team, out of our whole team, ultimately with accountability. I think that's it. And as I hear some of our comments that are being made, it's almost as if there's a misunderstanding in the air, and we need that cleared up. It sounds like you're doing that. Thank you. And I think we just keep, just moving forward as quickly and as our community needs what we're trying to achieve. We just don't need to be confused while we're working together. So I'll leave that alone.
Be looking forward to see what the task force, comes up with. Okay, are there any other questions from the board? Okay.
Not a question here, Jennifer, but just build on what William also said. This is why the task force is going to be there for the next year. It's a year-long project. And so hopefully the task force, the 3 EDC, along with the 3 P&Z members will come up with something and understand what the public wants as well. So I look forward to working with it. But I do have a question about the contract. Is the $75,000 just $75,000, or is there $4B dollars as well, or is it just this?
It's just this.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, any other comments from the board? Okay, we'll move on to item number 6, Director's Report. Elizabeth Huck, Director of Economic Development.
Good afternoon. Happy Mardi Gras, in case anyone has celebrated yet. Just have a few quick updates for you. DCI corresponded with Hope Biosciences to submit the organization as an emerging healthcare leader for managed healthcare executive August cover story. With a readership of 82,000 unique monthly visitors, the outlet caters to healthcare executives covering the latest medical innovations and thought leadership in the industry. Finalists are projected to be announced in May. So really excited to see if we can get some additional coverage from that. DCI also organized an exploratory call between our office and Seth Mendelson, who's the editorial director of business facilities, to explore economic development trends in Sugar Land for consideration of the outlet's April print issue. DCI is working with both parties to craft written responses for the feature that align with Sugar Land's brand messaging and positioning. And I'd be remiss if I don't ask again for everyone to go and follow us at Sugar Land Office of Economic Development on LinkedIn. We are constantly posting great stories. There was a good one today as well. And you can see a lot of the activity of our amazing team out there visiting businesses and promoting Sugar Land. So follow us, share it, help us gain some more visitors and some follows. And then also Visit Sugar Land is also on LinkedIn as well. So please follow us on that platform and Facebook and Twitter. So that's all I've got. Have a great evening.
Okay, do you have a motion to
Motion to
adjourn?
adjourn.
Okay.
You okay?
Talk to you later.
Carol and Lonnie.
TikTok.